At 10:18 p.m. on October the 29th, 2022, an emergency call came in from Itaewon, a densely packed nightlife district in Seoul, South Korea. And at first it did not sound like the beginning of a disaster, but like a crowd that was becoming too dense, where people were being pushed and movement was starting to slow. Over the next 2 hours, more calls followed, each one describing the same pattern. Then, shortly after 10:10 p.m., one final call came through. "It feels like people can get crushed here." By the time those words were spoken, the danger was no longer developing. It was already there. To understand how that night unfolded, it helps to understand what Itaewon represents, and why for many people in Seoul there was only ever one place to go on Halloween. Itaewon is the city's most well-known nightlife district, a dense network of bars, clubs and narrow streets, and every year it becomes the centre of Halloween celebrations, people arriving in costume, moving in between venues, filling the streets until the entire area becomes part of the celebration itself. But in 2022, something had changed. For nearly 2 years, South Korea had maintained strict COVID-19 restrictions, limiting gatherings, closing venues, and reshaping daily life in ways that made nights like this impossible. The crowds that would normally have spread themselves across seasons, weekends, and events had not disappeared, they had been held back. And when those restrictions were lifted, that demand did not return gradually. It arrived all at once. The space had not changed. The streets were the same, the alleyways just as narrow, the layout just as constrained as it always had been. What changed was the number of people entering it and the urgency with which they did so. One of them was 16-year-old Lee Jae-hyun, who had come to Itaewon with his girlfriend and his best friend, expecting nothing more than a night out in a place that felt alive again. At that point, there was no reason to think it would become anything else. Music carried out from bars and clubs, costumes filled the streets, and the atmosphere suggested a return to normal, even as the scale of the crowd building in those confined spaces began to exceed what the area had ever been designed to hold. By 5 p.m, the streets of Itaewon were already filling in a way that did not feel typical for that time of evening. Videos showed people packed shoulder to shoulder, with some attendees remarking that it was noticeably more crowded than in previous years. As the evening progressed, more people continued to arrive, drawn into a district that had no system controlling how many entered or how they moved once inside. At that stage, movement was still possible, and so the crowd expanded into every available space, filling the main streets, then the side roads, and eventually the narrow connecting alleyways that relied on constant movement to function. But it required effort, small adjustments, and a constant awareness of the people around you, the kind that comes when space is beginning to tighten but has not yet fully closed. And for many, that feeling registered as unusual rather than dangerous. What stood out was not just the density, but the direction of it, because even as people noticed how crowded it had become, the flow into the area did not slow. It increased. And once that movement begins to break down, what replaces it is not stillness, but pressure, something that builds gradually, almost unnoticed at first, until it becomes the defining condition of the space. Long before anything had visibly gone wrong, people inside the crowd were already asking for help. Emergency calls began coming in from across Itaewon as conditions worsened, describing spaces where movement had slowed to the point of stopping, and where people were being pushed without control, and where the density had reached a level that felt unsafe. One call, placed just after 6:30 p.m, explicitly asked for assistance managing the crowd, yet no meaningful reinforcement followed. Over the next several hours, at least 10 more calls were made, each one describing the same conditions, not as a sudden emergency, but as a situation that was steadily becoming harder to manage. On the ground, officers could see that density increasing. Some would later describe a sense of helplessness. They could see the risk, but they did not have the numbers or the authority to change what was happening. On that same night, thousands of officers had been deployed elsewhere in the city, covering a large protest and providing security for President Yoon Suk-yeol. Itaewon, despite being known as a focal point for Halloween, was left under-resourced. And by the time the final warnings came in, the conditions that would lead to the crowd crush were already in place. The space itself did not look dangerous. It was a narrow, sloping alley connecting two busy parts of the district, bordered closely by buildings and used throughout the night as a passage between streets. At its widest, it measured only a few meters across, but in practice it was narrower, as structures attached to the nearby buildings, including extensions near the Hamilton Hotel, reduced the usable space further, tightening the passage at the exact point where opposing flows met. Under normal conditions, that space remained manageable because people kept moving. That night they did not. As people entered from both ends, those flows began to interfere with each other, and movement slowed and then became restricted, and in some places stopped altogether. And once movement begins to fail in a crowd, something else replaces it. Pressure. The slope of the alley added to this, increasing the pressure on those lower down as more people continued to enter from behind, compressing the crowd in a way that was not immediately visible from the outside, but was clearly felt by those inside it. And once that movement began to break down, the nature of the crowd changed. There is a point in any crowd where it stops behaving like a collection of people and begins to behave more like a fluid, something that moves as a single mass rather than as individuals. At lower densities, individuals adjust instinctively, stepping aside, slowing down, creating space without thinking about it. But as that space disappears, those small adjustments stop working, and movement is no longer controlled by choice, but by force. Pressure begins to travel through the crowd in waves, what researchers describe as crowd turbulence, where one movement transfers into another, pushing people in directions they did not choose and cannot resist. In these conditions, forces can build to several thousand newtons, enough to bend metal, let alone the human body, compressing chests to the point where breathing becomes impossible. And when someone falls, even briefly, the space they leave behind is immediately filled by that pressure, triggering a domino effect as others are forced down on top of them. From the outside, it can look like a crowd standing still, but inside it is no longer a crowd in the normal sense. It is a system of moving force, and once that system forms, it does not need panic to become deadly. What it becomes is a deadly river of people, and once it starts moving, no one inside it can fight the current. Inside the alley, that point had already been passed. People were pressed together so tightly that movement was no longer a choice. Witnesses would later describe it as being pushed by something they could not see. Not people, but force. And this is what separates a crowd crush from a stampede. A stampede requires space to move, direction, the ability to run, but here there was no space at all, and the danger came not from motion, but from the absence of it, as pressure replaced movement entirely. At around 5 to 6 people per square metre, the space between individuals disappears completely, and what remains is not a group of people, but a system of force where every movement becomes part of something larger, something no one inside it can control. Awareness did not matter. Communication did not matter. Intent did not matter. It was physics. At around 10:20 p.m, the crowd reached a point where it could no longer hold itself upright. Near the lower end of the alley, individuals began to lose their footing, and in a less crowded space, that loss of balance would have been recoverable. What followed was not a single moment, but a rapid accumulation. From the outside, there was no clear signal that people were dying, only a dense mass of people. What was happening was not trampling, but compressive asphyxia. The chest could no longer expand, air was present, but could not be drawn in. For many, this did not happen on the ground, it happened where they stood. Held upright by the force of the crowd, unable to move, unable to create space, their breathing became shallower and then impossible as the pressure around them continued to increase. Others, already beneath the layers, were subjected to even greater weight, compressed under multiple bodies where survival depended entirely on how quickly that pressure could be relieved. In this case, the density of the crowd made that relief nearly impossible within the time needed to prevent fatal outcomes. A survivor, Nuyil Ahmed, later described the moment simply, "I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die." Witnesses later described seeing 5 or 6 layers of people pressed together, hearing voices from below calling out that they could not breathe, voices that became quieter as the weight above them increased. One survivor, Ju Hyun, would later be able to point to the exact place where she lost her footing. As she fell, there was no space to recover, The crowd closed over her almost instantly. The pressure was so intense that the muscles in her legs ruptured, leaving her unable to move as bodies piled on top of her and the weight continued to build. And then she lost consciousness. When she came to, she was still trapped. There were screams everywhere, she said. People in the crowd were shouting, "Please help me, I don't want to die." And from the buildings above, people were shouting back, "Please don't die, please don't die." Over time, those voices began to fade. Some tried to climb the walls, reaching for anything that might lift them out of the pressure, while others held on to friends in an effort to stay upright. But in conditions like these, individual effort made little difference, because movement was no longer controlled by people. It was controlled by the crowd, and the crowd was still moving. By the time the emergency services began to arrive, the conditions that had caused the crowd crush were also preventing any effective rescue. Ambulances were dispatched shortly after 10:25 p.m, but the surrounding streets were so congested that reaching the scene took longer than it should have. Once they did get close, they could only pull victims out one at a time. Bystanders began performing CPR wherever space allowed, and one witness recalled faces that had turned blue, bodies that were unresponsive, and the realization that many of the people they were trying to help were already beyond recovery. Phones continued to ring among the victims, unanswered, repeating again and again, while inside nearby venues, staff and patrons worked together to bring the injured indoors and create enough space to continue resuscitation efforts. But by then, the scale of what had happened had already moved beyond what could be reversed. By the early hours of the morning, the enormity of what had happened could no longer be contained. The death toll would reach 159. Hundreds more were injured, many suffering the effects of prolonged compression, including cardiac arrest, severe breathing impairment, fractures and internal injuries caused by sustained pressure on the body. While others who survived would later report lasting psychological trauma, including anxiety, panic responses in crowded spaces, and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. Across the city, families searched for information, moving between hospitals, calling phones that would not be answered, and waiting for confirmation. Identification took days. Many victims carried no identification, and with such a large number of casualties arriving across multiple hospitals at once, authorities relied on fingerprints, personal belongings, and DNA testing, while families submitted missing persons reports and waited to be matched with those who had been found. Personal belongings were gathered from the scene, including hundreds of shoes, and these were laid out in rows as families searched for any sign that might help them understand who had been there. For some, recognition came not through official confirmation, but through what had been left behind. In other cases, it came in more direct and more painful ways, a phone answered by someone else, or a call that was never returned. For some, the disaster did not end when the crowd cleared. 16-year-old Lee Jae-hyun had been trapped in the center of the crush alongside his best friend and his girlfriend, unable to move as he watched her lose consciousness. Moments later, he too stopped breathing. He survived, but from his hospital bed he learnt that they had both died. In the weeks that followed, his family would say he was no longer the same. Before, he was cheerful, his mother said. Afterwards, he barely spoke. He sat alone in his room and he couldn't sleep. 43 days after the disaster, he took his own life. In the days that followed, it became clear that the risk had not gone unnoticed. Internal police reports had warned in advance that large Halloween crowds were expected in Itaewon, highlighting the potential for dangerous overcrowding in exactly the kind of narrow spaces where the crush would later occur. But those warnings had not translated into a coordinated crowd control plan. There were no systems in place to limit entry, manage flow, or prevent people from being drawn into confined areas as numbers increased. As the investigation progressed, further questions emerged, including allegations that some of those internal reports had later been removed or altered, raising concerns about how information had been handled in the aftermath. Amid that scrutiny, one police intelligence officer connected to the case, who had been involved in preparing the original risk assessment, was found dead weeks later in what was ruled a suicide. He had reportedly been under significant pressure during the investigation. For many, it reinforced a wider sense that responsibility was difficult to pin down, not because the risks were unknown, but because they had been recognized without being acted upon. Several officials were charged, and some local officials and emergency response personnel were later convicted of negligence, receiving suspended prison sentences for failures in planning and response. Among those charged was Kim Kwang-ho, the former head of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency, and the most senior official to face criminal proceedings in connection with the disaster. Prosecutors argued that failures in planning and response had contributed to the conditions that developed that night, raising the question of whether what happened could have been prevented. In court, however, those questions proved more difficult to resolve. In 2024, Kim was acquitted of negligence, with the court ruling that the evidence presented did not establish criminal liability for the events of that night. For the families of those who died, the outcome did not change what had been lost. The question of accountability for many remained. In the months that followed, the alley itself changed. Parts of it were boarded up. Some of the bars that once lined it never reopened. What had once been a crowded passage became something quieter, almost hollow, a place marked less by movement than by memory. For many, the space did not return to what it had been. It remained associated with what had happened there, with who died there. There is still no permanent official memorial at the site. Instead, families have maintained their own altar lined with photographs of those who died and returning in shifts to watch over it. Not out of ceremony alone, but out of concern that it might be removed. At times, authorities have suggested it should be cleared. For the families, it is one of the few places where the loss remains visible. For those who went out that night, it began like any other celebration. Friends meeting, music, expectation. But what makes the Itaewon disaster difficult to understand is that for much of the evening, nothing appeared to be going wrong. There was no clear moment where everything changed, no single trigger that marked the beginning of the danger, only a steady accumulation, people arriving, space filling, movement slowing, pressure building. What happened did not begin with chaos, it began with density. By the time the danger became visible, it was already too late. On that night in Itaewon, the space ran out, and behind each of those 159 lives was someone who had stepped into that crowd believing they would walk back out of it, not knowing that by that point there was already nowhere to go. This was a terrible tragedy both for Seoul and for South Korea. People went out that evening expecting a glorious celebration after an extended period of lockdown. Sadly, a great many of them never returned home. Our condolences go out to the families of those who lost their lives that night, and our best wishes to all those who were injured. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say bye-bye for now.